Now, egoism as an ethical theory, as an answer to the question, what makes right acts right and wrong acts wrong, does not, in fact, seem very plausible. And I think that if you consult your intuitions about right and wrong, you'll be able to see why. Lots of people are, in fact, generally speaking, often and for most of their lives, egoists in the present philosophical sense of that term, no doubt. And in many cases, how an egoist behaves and how a utilitarian behave are going to overlap. They'll be coextensive. Not necessarily all, but for many cases. There's also evidence that a policy of looking out for number one, so to speak, the kind of thing that the ethical egoist propounds is what you should do, is good for such things as market economies. Private vice leads to public virtue, as the neoclassical economists were often wont to say. However, I think we can agree that there seems to be many cases in which acting egoistically, in the ethical egoist sense of the term, is morally objectionable, is something that violates our views about right and wrong. So suppose that on my bike ride here to campus today, dressed as I was in my shirt and tie, reasonably nice clothes by my own relatively modest standards. Suppose that I was riding my bike in and I happened to be cycling by a pond in which I happened to notice out of the corner of my eye a man who was drowning. He was clearly flailing about, clearly having a terrible time making his way to the surface of that body of water. Now, it might have crossed my mind, should I stop? Should I save him? I'm a decent swimmer. There doesn't seem to be anything terribly dangerous for myself going into that water. This guy just does not seem able to swim for whatever reason. I could probably help him out. Now, if I were an ethical egoist, I probably would say to myself, or I might very well say to myself, well, his life is his, and it doesn't concern me very much. As long as no one else is around to watch me behave this way, I don't see anybody else on the horizon. No one will know about this, and he doesn't even see me. So I think I'll just go on my way. After all, I don't want to get my clothes wet. I don't want to get muddy. I'd have to go back home and clean up and change and do all sorts of things that would lengthen my day and be a general hassle. Can't be bothered. I want to carry on, get my way over to campus, and let this guy, hope this guy is able to make it out of the water. Now, if in fact you were to see me doing something like that, you would probably describe my behavior as morally monstrous. That is to say, if acting on my own egoistic interests is something that allows somebody else to perish, then most of us would probably say that that choice is a morally objectionable one. I've done something wrong by not making some effort to help the guy. If I thought that I might drown myself because of something about the water, perhaps it was wintertime and it was ice cold, or I thought there was quicksand nearby, or something terribly noxious in the water, where at least I should have called the ambulance or the authorities, the police or something, but not try to put myself in danger, then you might understand why I'd stay out of the water. But in this case, supposing that there's no reason to think there's anything dangerous at all about my going in and saving this man, I would just become muddied, wet, soaked through and so forth. Those things you might say are an inconvenience, but by no means enough to justify allowing this fellow human being to drown. If you think that, then I think you're implicitly agreeing that egoism as an ethical theory is not an acceptable ethical theory, because there are many situations you can easily imagine, like this one, the case of the drowning man in the pond, in which a person's choice seems to show that they've done something morally abominable, even if doing so is what's dictated by the egoistic ethical theory. So in order to understand our ethical theories, we often want to put them to the test of seeing how they would apply to various hypothetical cases, or even better, to actual situations, and then consulting our instincts, our intuitions, our reactions to how we would judge people who behave in those ways as ways of testing the adequacy of those theories. And I'm suggesting now that the egoistic theory does not measure up because it has implications for not too far-fetched cases that would have us do things that, according to our own instincts, would be morally objectionable. Notice also that the utilitarian theory, now that we've explained how the utilitarian is different from the egoist and how the egoist seems to give prescriptions that seem morally objectionable, notice that the utilitarian theory has implications not just for what I as an individual should do, but also for what a society should do. So Bentham points out that the interests of the community is just the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. It's just an aggregate, he'll say, and as such, if you're trying to decide what policy to pursue, should you, for example, carry out lots of high-level advertising explaining to people the dangers of smoking, or trying to tax sugary sodas in order to decrease the amount of obesity? Should you require motorcycle riders to wear helmets, etc., etc.? The utilitarian is going to say that should be determined by the question whether or not having a policy of that kind is one that maximizes overall utility. So now it looks like we're seeing that the utilitarian theory applies not just to individual choice, but to so-called social choice as well. So that in determining the moral status of an action from the utilitarian point of view, social happiness, insofar as it's a strict function of the happiness of its members, is something that can also be considered in deciding about policies that can have implications for an entire society. And Bentham, although he's writing at a time with a set of tools that are more crude than we have now, imagines we could actually develop something fairly sophisticated. He's looking back to people like Isaac Newton and Leibniz, who had developed powerful mathematical theories that helped apply to beginning to harness the powers of the physical world. Bentham and those who followed him thought, if only we could do the same thing or something like it for the social world, for the psychological realm, we'd have a great deal of ability to improve society as well. So Bentham imagined what he called the philosophic calculus. The philosophic calculus being an algorithm for determining rigorously what actions are right, both at the individual and at the society level, to determine what we should do. So he said, if you want to make that calculus, you should take the following factors into account. In deciding the implications for a certain choice, look at the consequences, the outcomes, and then think about how intense is that outcome. For example, if I'm deciding between one kind of experience, for example, having one kind of food or reading one kind of novel, watching one kind of movie or another, how intense will that experience be? Duration, how long will that experience be for? Whether it be good or bad, its duration is going to be a matter that will be, as it were, plugged into the calculus. How certain or uncertain is a certain outcome? That is, before we get to the outcome, we need to take into account the likelihood that that outcome will occur, given the possible states of the world. When he talks about, Bentham uses the term propinquity as a slightly antiquated word for how close it is. That is to say, we tend to prefer actions that have implications relatively soon rather than relatively far away. Economists use the same notion under the term time discounting. Fecundity, that is to say, how likely is this happiness or unhappiness likely to reproduce itself over time? Will it recur? Will it cause similar experiences to happen in the future or not? Purity, that is the experience going to be one that's mixed with something of an opposite kind? That is, will the happiness be mixed with various kinds of pain, or the unhappiness be mixed with various kinds of pleasure? That will be an issue as well. The extent, that is, how many people will be affected by the happiness or unhappiness or other kind of implication of the action that I'm considering. Bentham suggests that if we take all those into account, we can develop a rigorous, scientific, maybe even mathematically tractable way of calculating what makes right acts right and what makes right acts wrong. And while we can disagree with the specifics, with the details of Bentham's method for doing the calculation, we can admire, I think, the idea that we could break this complex problem down into its parts and develop a kind of physics of right and wrong, mathematics of right and wrong, in which we would be able to calculate rigorously what policy to pursue, both at the individual and the social level, in such a way as to produce the greatest overall amount of happiness.